This week on C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast, Santa Clara University history professor Sonia Gomez explores the intimate relationships between people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds in Hawaii and Japan during and after World War II. Professor Gomez is the author of Picture Bride, War Bride, The Role of Marriage in Shaping Japanese America, which examines how marriage critically shaped Japanese American identity and community. And a note to our listeners. With the academic year now wrapped, Lectures in History will pause new episodes until September. Over the summer, we'll revisit some of our most compelling past lectures and other history-related content. This episode was originally on the feed in March of 2025. Professor Gomez's lecture begins after this.
So let's talk about World War II. So World War II entanglements. Today we're just going to talk about Japan and Hawaii. So we're looking at these entanglements specifically in the Pacific. So what do I mean by entanglements? So this word refers to the intimate relationships between people from different racial, ethnic, social, and economic and religious backgrounds that emerged during and immediately after World War II, as we'll see in Hawaii and Japan. These relationships were the result of increased U.S. military presence across the globe. Again, specifically, we're talking about Hawaii and Japan today, and existed within a broader systems of power. So we'll kind of flesh some of that out today. Strange Place. The chapters that I assigned came from this book, The First Strange Place. And what do they mean by strange place? Like, why is Hawaii considered a strange place? So Hawaii during World War II is actually a U.S. territory. So it's it's not a state, right? Hawaii does not receive statehood until 1959 after World War II. And as a U.S. territory, almost immediately after territory status, the U.S. military starts to increase on the island. And what that does is it produces and kind of codifies the power of a Haole elite. These are predominantly white, upper middle class mainlanders who come to Hawaii for business, expand on their businesses. They come for leisure. And so the Haole elite become economically and politically very powerful before territorial status, but also that power is solidified and codified during territory period. But as we see in the text, whiteness was not the natural condition. So what do we mean by that? So Hawaii is the first strange place because it's unique in a lot of ways, right? It's on the outer edge of the Pacific, right? It is the kind of most western frontier, right? And in addition to the Haoles, right, the kind of elite white class of people, there are class divisions even within Haole communities. There's also obviously a sizable Native population, right? So we have Native Hawaiians and also other Polynesians. And then because of labor migration, we have a pretty large Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Korean, Portuguese, and Puerto Rican population, right? These communities all have roots in labor migration that preceded World War II, right? So we have a highly mixed and diverse population in Hawaii. Japanese Americans were actually the largest ethnic group, and people often wonder why the Japanese were not incarcerated in Hawaii as they were on the U.S. mainland. Does anybody know why? Kenneth.
From what I remember, it was because the Japanese made up the majority of the working force, so that when Japanese Americans were told to go to the incarceration camps, Hawaii couldn't comply with that because the majority of their working force was Japanese.
Yeah, they were the largest ethnic group, about 37% of the population, and they were at this point integral to the economy and the workforce, right? So it was just not feasible, right? I'll talk about in a second how martial law kind of flattened out a lot of differences. There were a large or smaller portion who were incarcerated, about 1,400, a little over 1,400, which, you know, in comparison to over 120,000 on the mainland U.S. that were incarcerated, that number is pretty small. And those were predominantly men who were considered, whether their political activity or their activity within the community were considered liable, and their loyalty was put into question, and so they were incarcerated, but the majority of the Japanese American population was not. Okay, so Hawaii is also a strange place during the war because it's under martial law, right? So December 7th, 1941, that's the day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Martial law is instituted on the island, and it lasts until October 1944. So the majority of the war, Hawaii is under military rule. And what does that mean? That means there's blackouts, there's curfews, residents have to carry an ID. If they have to be out past curfew for whatever reason, likely because of their job, they have to get special passes. The media, newspaper, radio were all censored. So in some ways, Japanese incarceration was, the Japanese were incarcerated like they were on mainland Japan because martial law kind of kept everybody on a strict kind of lockdown throughout the war. So in addition to martial law, over 1 million servicemen and war workers passed through Hawaii at some point during the war. And as we read on the chapter on Hotel Street, about 30,000 American men, mostly American servicemen, visited the area of Hotel Street on any given day. So can you imagine? 30,000 American servicemen are, hanging out, walking through, standing in lines, doing whatever. We know what they're doing on Hotel Street, right, on any given day. So there's martial law. There's an influx of predominantly white servicemen, just servicemen. So Hawaii is a very, interesting place to be during World War II, to say the least. So here is a couple photos I wanted to show you. The one on the left are 2 Japanese American children wearing a gas mask. So part of martial law, or part of the kind of war effort, the fear of Japanese invasion was kind of imminent throughout the entire war, although it started to kind of wane as the war progressed. And so everybody on the islands were given a gas mask. And then here is a sample of a curfew pass. So if somebody had to be out past curfew, they'd have to get a special pass that they had to carry with them at all times. And then the blackouts, right, meant people had to cover their windows. They didn't want a lot of light. They wanted to reduce the light pollution of the islands. So as you can see here on this photo on the left, a restaurant says, enter through this door during blackout. You don't need to go hungry, right? So all of the windows are boarded up, and U.S. Servicemen can still go to the restaurant past blackout hours. Here on the right is a picture of Waikiki Beach with barbed wires. So the beach, much of the leisurely spots that we think of today in our imagination of Hawaii were off limits to Hawaiian citizens, or I should say Hawaiian residents, and they became part of the military, right? And they were used for training, but also in this image, R&R, right? Rest and relaxation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about sporting girls. What was prostitution like before World War I? What do you remember from the reading? Okay, I'll tell you. So before World War II, prostitution, which these women were referred to kind of colloquially as sporting girls, was what she calls an open secret, right? The authors. In other words, prostitution was deemed necessary, right? In order to protect what was believed respectable women. They created like a buffer, right? So it was kind of seen as this necessary evil, if you will, an open secret. And it was regulated, right? So the women they received testing, VD testing, and also care. There was also sanitation codes that they had to keep up, right, to make sure that the brothels stayed up to these sanitary codes. And they also were really restricted, right? They weren't allowed to live on Waikiki Beach. There were only a few places in Hawaii, in Honolulu specifically, where they could live. So their housing was restricted, their mobility was restricted, right? They couldn't go out after 10:30 p.m. They weren't allowed to own cars. They weren't allowed to buy property, to buy homes, right? So their lives were really restricted. Most of the prostitutes, both in the pre-war and post-war period, were mostly haole women, mostly white women from the mainland. And prostitution was regulated under the vice squad of the Honolulu police, right? So those were the authorities that oversaw the practice of prostitution and made sure that the rules and regulations ran smoothly. And of course, this is a picture of Jean O'Hara, who figures prominently in the chapter on Hotel Street. Okay. So how did Pearl Harbor and World War II change the lives of the women working on Hotel Street? There was an increased workload, right? I'm using air quotes. Increased workload because there were a large number of American servicemen who were coming through the islands, right, and in search of affection. So that meant there was an increased opportunity to earn money. And as we saw with Jean O'Hara, to earn a lot of money, right? She later on bought herself a brand new car and bought homes. They bought property. There were also looser regulations. The business became just so overwhelmed that sanitation codes were violated more often, right? Because Vice Squad wasn't checking as often. The Vice Squad, the police, people were so overwhelmed with the amount of traffic in these areas. So the regulations were a bit looser. And what that meant was that there was greater mobility for the women because they had money, right? But that greater mobility, like owning the car, like buying a home, came at a kind of unlikely, came about through an unlikely allyship between the prostitutes and the military governor. Does anybody remember why? Oscar.
Like, keep morale high, they said, for the soldiers there. And it was like a good partnership.
Yeah, so interestingly, although the head of the Vice Squad, or the head of the Honolulu PD, wanted to continue to restrict the prostitutes, the military governor saw that looser regulations were better because it served the military, right? To keep the boys' morale high, they needed to have kind of easy access, right? And it was seen as a kind of military necessity to ensure that the prostitutes were happy, right? So they wouldn't strike, which is what they did, right? Or they wouldn't raise their prices, which they tried to do, right? So in order to kind of keep this segment of the labor market happy so that they can serve the needs of the military, compromises had to be made, right? And one of those compromises was to allow the women to to have more mobility, right? To be able to like rent or buy a home outside of the confines of which they were restricted before the war, right? So that's how women like Jean O'Hara and her group of friends are able to purchase property in areas that they normally wouldn't be able to, right? So there's an unlikely allyship between the military governor and prostitutes during the war. So the war seems to be kind of you know, the war, how do I want to say this? It brings upon like new opportunities for the prostitutes in a interesting way. You wouldn't like normally think that, right? So yeah.
Off topic, but that just like kind of parallels, I feel like, the first reading, which was about the GIs in France and like how people viewed the men as having like sexual needs that couldn't be suppressed. And I went, so like it totally, there was totally a double standard between like men and women, and how like men like really couldn't like contain that side of them, and they just thought it a bit ugly, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, nobody was questioning the fact that the I don't know, servicemen's. I gotta say this, this is like tricky. Servicemen's desires were like never questioned. It was just like taken for granted that these men needed to have access to women's bodies, right? And so how to make that, how to ease that, but also to appease local governments, right? With that reading in France, you're talking about French authorities, right? Here we're talking about the vice squad at the Honolulu Police Department, but the military governor is overseeing that. So there's different kind of competing agendas, local agendas, but broader kind of military agendas, right? And all said and done, at least in the example of Hawaii, that works in the favor for the prostitutes, right?
From what I remember, it allowed for more interracial marriages between some of the black GIs that came over, and then the I guess Native women. I remember they were treated better than how they were on the mainland, so it opened up for actual relationships to be had.
Okay, great. Yeah, so there's an increase in interracial relationships, right? What else? What about the gender imbalance? Remember all of those servicemen who are in Hawaii? What would that do to the gender imbalance? And what would that do for women's choices? Okay. So like Alex said, there's an increase in interracial relationships. There's also a breakdown of traditional dating and courtship norms. So people are kind of like on a faster timeline, right? We're in the middle of war. They don't really know how the war is going to end, right? So people are rushing to marriage, right? There's rates of children being born out of wedlock, right? So like being born to unmarried parents, that increases. People are marrying after just a few months of knowing each other. And then women gain more independence and agency in who they choose to date and marry. And part of this is the gender imbalance, which if you remember, is kind of highlighted throughout the text, right? There's just a lot of men. So they kind of have their pick, right? And the last piece is that the military and the kind of trauma of war, right? Some of these men had seen combat and were in Hawaii and R&R. Some were training and were about to go to the war in the Pacific, right? So this kind of intense stress, right? And this kind of uncertainty during the war really made a lot of these servicemen kind of vulnerable in a lot of ways, right? And so as Beth Bailey and David Farber in the text highlight, a lot of times they were just looking to, just to kind of talk, right, to women. Women were doing a lot of intimate labor, like not just, in thinking about sex work, but thinking about, just befriending and listening and just, kind of helping to boost the morale of the thousands and thousands of servicemen who were throughout Hawaii, right? And for a lot of these women, they saw that as their like effort for the war, right? That was part of their war effort. Okay, so any questions about Hawaii before we move on? Yeah, Sophie?
With Black men also being drafted to the war, I was wondering if there was like, I guess, a difference, or if you know anything about like them being like sexualized, because I feel like if black men were like overly sexualized back in the mainland in the US, so if like it'd be different if they were seen reinforce that stereotype, but since all servicemen of like all backgrounds were going to prostitutes in Hawaii, was it just kind of like everyone was sensual, or?
Yeah, well, yes, so both. Both those things are true. But yeah, no, absolutely. In Hawaii, so a lot of those like mainland ideas are present in Hawaii as well, right? Especially, or in particularly like Black masculinity. What's interesting though, at these brothels is that majority of them were off limits to Black servicemen. But that stereotype continues to, that stereotype permeates Hawaii and Japan as well, right? It kind of follows wherever Black servicemen go.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Okay, oh no, we're here, Jim Crow. Okay, so now we're gonna kind of shift a little bit and go a little bit northeast in the Pacific, anyways, to Japan. So Jim Crow Tokyo. Okay, yeah. I was gonna make a joke, but that wasn't gonna be good. Okay, so let's talk about Jim Crow Tokyo. What is the term Jim Crow Tokyo? What is that referring to? Hayes?
It referred to how during the occupation of Japan by the U.S., kind of like just during how the military imported American racism, where the segregation laws that they implemented were sort of mirroring that of the Jim Crow laws in the American South, that Japanese people were oppressed in a kind of similar way to Black people.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to be clear, there were no kind of legal like Jim Crow laws in Tokyo, right? But like Hayes said, it was like a mirroring, right? So when you think about migration, you think about like the movement of people, they're also bringing their ideas, right? Cultural norms. And so with the presence of the US military came the presence of the kind of American racial hierarchy, right? So after the war ends in 1945, the U.S. deploys about almost 1 million American troops to Japan. This is what we call the Allied occupation of Japan. And they haven't left, but the military presence stays pretty high throughout the occupation and as well as the Korean War. So like the Pacific, Japan becomes an important kind of strategic military location for the United States. Military imported racism that we just talked about. And like Hawaii, American servicemen engaged in a range of intimate relationships with Japanese women. And that range included sex work, right? Prostitution, which was referred to as panpan girls, kind of long-term relationships within the sex industry. So a woman might have just one partner that she sees most of the time. They dated, they courted, they had long-term relationships, short-term relationships, but there was also a large number of marriages. Between 1947 and 1965, it's estimated that about 50,000 Japanese women came to the U.S. As brides to American servicemen. Now, that doesn't include the ones who didn't arrive in the U.S. It doesn't include those relationships who, for whatever reason, she was not able to migrate. And then it doesn't include a large number of these relationships, or a large number of the women came through special private laws that were introduced on her specific behalf. And I'll talk about that in a second. So in other words, the numbers I think are kind of off, and we don't know exactly how many women came because they came in through different channels. Okay, so how were the relationships between Black servicemen and Japanese women during the occupation, but also during the Korean War? How were they regulated and constrained?
I guess one way might have been the GI Prize Act, which initially they said was to expedite the admission of the U.S. of alien spouses and alien minor children of citizen members of the U.S. Armed Forces, but what it actually did was bar alien spouses who were quote, racially ineligible, which included Japanese women.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll get to, the GI Bride Act, passed in 1945, allows the expedited entry of war brides. So the U.S. was not just in Japan and Hawaii, as we know, right? They were in France and Germany, in Britain, and servicemen brought home women from every place in which the military was stationed. So a large number of women came from Europe, and the GI Bride Act was specifically targeted for the European brides of American servicemen. So it left Japanese women, because they were racially ineligible to naturalize, it left them excluded from that pathway to the U.S. So immigration law. Okay, so what else? How else were these relationships regulated, policed, constricted?
I know that in order for them to get married, they would also have to ask, or I don't know what word, someone
Get
in the
permission,
military, how to get
yeah.
permission, and a lot of times they would deny it when it wouldn't have been a problem if these women were white, but it was because they didn't want them to get married, have kids, or because they're having kids out of wedlock with these Japanese women.
Okay, so the military, right? The military wouldn't offer permission for a variety of reasons. One is they are trying to control the lives of their servicemen, right? And it is, so there is a no fraternization policy, right? Which really pertains to prostitution. But the military is not keen on servicemen fraternizing with the local population, right? Especially when that local population is Asian, right? Japanese. So the military, although there's no kind of outright ban on marriages, they are not granting permission for a variety of reasons. And one of those reasons is they typically refer to immigration law. They cite immigration law as well, you can't, I'm not going to allow you to get married because your bride can't immigrate to Japan or immigrate to the U.S., right? So they lean on immigration law and a lot of times, but not only. Anything else? Kenneth?
What I also remember reading, black servicemen following the end of World War II got sent to Korea for the Korean War, and then when they were in Korea, they were discharged from service, I believe. So instead of going back to Japan, where they had lived their lives and married, they were instead sent back to the U.S. And so that was another way they were kind of regulating and constraining interracial marriage.
Yes, absolutely. They call this acts of sabotage, right? They felt that the military was strategically moving men around to ensure that they couldn't, to kind of sever those bonds that they had with their Japanese girlfriend or wife, right? So one of the examples they gave is before being married, if word got out that somebody was wanting to get married, or there was a number of men in a certain regiment who wanted to get married, that they'd be mysteriously deployed to Korea, and then after that sent home to the U.S. so that it left those vows unspoken, right? I think this is what the NAACP called acts of sabotage, or it might be the Chicago Defender. I can't quite remember. Okay. So I think we talked about most of these. The military had a non-fraternization policy, which prohibited prostitution. The military often cited immigration law, acts of sabotage that Kenneth just spoke about. But also these relationships were debated and scrutinized, both in the kind of mainstream American press, but also within the Black press. So let's talk a little bit about the immigration restrictions. So as you might recall from earlier classes, the 1924 National Origins Act essentially barred all immigration from Japan, and it also severely restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. And so that was the immigration law of the time when World War II began. And then as we mentioned a few minutes ago, in 1945, Congress passes the GI Brides Act. This is mostly to facilitate the immigration of European brides of American servicemen. Japanese women are excluded because they are racially ineligible for citizenship. And what is the law that makes them racially ineligible? Anyone? Hayes. Yes, naturalization. And what year? Yes, 1790. Okay, the Naturalization Act of 1790 prohibits Asian immigrants from gaining citizenship. Okay. But then in 1947, Congress passes the Alien Brides Act. And this specifically allows those women who are ineligible by the 1945 Act to migrate, right? So in other words, Japanese women. But that act gives them like a 30-day time frame in which they have to apply, they have to marry, then they have to apply, they have to jump through all these kind of bureaucratic red tape in order to gain permission to immigrate to the US. So lots did, lots didn't. And later on in 1950, that act was amended to extend until 1952. So even though there were these restrictions, like a large number of women were able to immigrate, even through all of these restrictive legislative barriers. Then in 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act allows all Japanese born to naturalize, so that's the repeal of the Naturalization Act, and essentially lifts the ban on Asian migration and Asian naturalization. So after 1952, now this is, years after the Allied occupation. This is 7 years after the end of World War II, right? But the US is still in Japan. There's still a large presence of American servicemen, and they are still marrying in large numbers. But in 1952, that becomes much more easy for Japanese women to immigrate to the US. And that's why we have numbers like before, the statistic I showed you before that was like 30,000 women, it starts at 45 and goes to 65, because even though the war ends and the occupation period ends, there's the Korean War. The US military, as we know, hasn't left Japan, so there continues to be Japanese women who are marrying American servicemen. And then in 1965, the Hart-Celler Act lifts the 1924 ban. So these are the immigration restrictions that Japanese women and their American servicemen, both black and white, had to navigate in order to immigrate to the US. And then going back to thinking about like media and the ways in which these relationships were kind of scrutinized, both in the mainstream and black press. So here's an article from 1952 in Ebony, a popular magazine. It says, "The Truth About Japanese War Brides." What feelings do you get when you see this? What does the title imply? Why would they be interested in these relationships? And Sophie?
It almost seems like they're trying to say something about these women, that they have like an undercover like plot or plan for the reason of marrying these people.
Yeah.
And that they're not actually doing it for love or affection, that they're actually doing it to maybe like infiltrate America.
Okay. So you feel some like anti-Asian sentiment in this. Okay, Alex?
It seems like, at least the part in the news, the little paper right there, soldiers started to admire legendary qualities of attractive Nippon women. That's an unbelievable quote.
Why is it unbelievable?
Legendary qualities is like I don't even know what that would entail, but it's very weird.
Do you remember, was it last week that I showed you the photo of Madame Butterfly? We talked about Madame, right? Anything else? Yeah, it's implying like the truth, like there's a suspicion, right, about these women, right? But there's also this kind of Madame Butterfly trope that's being applied, right? And let's see. Oh, wait, let me move ahead a little bit. Here's another one. This is from, I think this is from Jet magazine. Also a black magazine, African American press. Oh, so this is switched, actually. So this is supposed to be on that side and vice versa. So it reads, "Do Japanese women make better wives?" right? Any thoughts?
It reminds me of what I think we talked about maybe last week or sometime during the quarter about how like Asian women were kind of seen as more docile, like better in the kitchen and stuff like that, and more submissive. So it reminds me of that.
Okay. Yes. Jessica, you also had your hand up. Okay.
On that, like we talked about it last week in our group presentation.
Yeah.
About how they, Japanese women were led to they were looked at as more submissive, and they catered to their husbands, and that made them better wives. They would take care of the children, take care of your husband, and they do whatever you tell them to do, which quote unquote made them better spouses.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. They're definitely playing on these stereotypes of Asian women, particularly in this case, Japanese women, as being better wives, being better in the domestic sphere, right? Absolutely. So many hands. Okay, Alexander?
A question like that, do Japanese women make better wives? It takes away any like personhood from Japanese women and kind of boxes them into like, this is how we're going to be and how all Japanese women are, and then allows like this image in the heads of basically all men that, oh, if you want this type of wife, then a Japanese woman is going to fit that standard rather than, I guess, looking at Japanese women as people.
Yeah, they're kind of being generalized. Yeah. Okay, got it. Good. Claire, and then Sophie.
I feel like the caption, or not the caption, the title kind of like implies like a battle between like Japanese women or like black women or whoever else black women being like one is the better wife and you can't both just be good wives, and one is better and you can't fight for the better spot.
Absolutely. It is putting these women in competition with each other, right? Do they make better wives? Better than what? Better than who, right?
It's interesting because it kind of pushes on the, like, you know, the anti-miscegenation laws of it. Like, it's like this is a kind of not uncommon for the time, like pairing. Like, it isn't just like a folded white marriage, but then they're still pushing the same like gender stereotypes. So it's like really not pushing any sort of boundaries. It's just reinforcing those sort of beliefs.
Okay, maybe it's not pushing any gender boundaries, but maybe other boundaries they are. Okay, yeah, so reinforcing some of these like gendered stereotypes and these gender hierarchies, yes. Let's see, we'll do Hayes and then Sophie again.
I think just adding on to that, it definitely plays like the gender stereotypes at the time, like that. In that it maybe creates competition among women at this time. It's almost like who can best embody these stereotypes. Like who can be the most docile and subservient, who can be, like Eric said, better. I was sort of reading the text a little bit. And
good eyesight.
it says like, I feel it is my duty to do my husband's bidding. And if this makes me different from American women, that I don't know what to do about it, because acting this way makes him happy. If he's happy, I'm happy. So it's almost like it's their sole purpose to serve a man, which is kind of disheartening.
Sophie, did you want to add?
Yeah, I was also reading the text, and in the last paragraph, it says that like that the trend in America is that women want rights and they want more freedom, but Japanese women don't want this. So if you marry a Japanese wife, she won't like talk back to you, or she won't try to gain rights. So it also is perpetuating this like stereotype that women need to be below men and actively moving against feminism.
Okay, good. Cindy?
And then I also just think that this is kind of like a transition period, like into now what is still like very predominant, like the model minority and how it kind of started with Japanese and other Asian women, and like having this idea that they're somehow like still like almost like the superior wife, like as like everyone has been mentioning, but yeah, they're now seen in a different light. Like whereas before they were pretty much doing anything they could to not have these marriages happen, whereas now they're almost used as a token to almost send a signal to like other women of color, like see like
In this day? Or in this period? Oh, okay. Oh, this period. Okay.
We don't hate all people of color. Like we like them, so like just be more like them. Like something like that, which is still something that I believe is like very prevalent today. But like I this could be a very important transition period.
Yeah. I think I mentioned it last week about scholars pointing to Japanese war brides as the quote-unquote first model minority, right? And this is just one piece, right? This is in a Black magazine, Jet, but there were lots others, right, in kind of mainstream, and all are surprisingly very similar, right, about how they view Japanese womanhood. And the interesting thing is, in a lot of ways, her, perceived, whether it's real or not, like submissiveness is also predicated on the ways in which she was able to migrate. So she's only able, right, the Japanese war bride, the figure of the Japanese war bride is only able to migrate as the wife of an American serviceman, right? And before 1952, when the McCarran-Walter Act allows Japanese and Asian immigrants to naturalize, she can't naturalize. So her entire kind of legal status in the US is based on her marriage, right? And so that adds this layer of this power dynamic, right, between husband and wife, right? In addition to conquer and conquered, right? The victor, the loser of the war. So there's all these layers in which power is mapped onto these relationships. And then that power is read in these very kind of gendered ways about how she's submissive and the best kind of wife and all these kind of Orientalist tropes, right?
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Did you have your hand up, Eddie?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, like, kind of what you just said, where it's like, it seems like a way for media to stifle Japanese advancement in American society altogether, because it's basically saying, like, oh, these women can come over, but only if they stay in the home, and not, like, we don't want them as part of our society, part of our workforce, we just want them in the home.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, right? Because they come as wives, right? They don't come as laborers, they don't come as students, they come as wives. And although there's no restrictions barring their employment, and a lot of women do have to work outside the home because unfortunately for them, they thought they were marrying into these like wealthy families, and just to find out that their husbands are like, poor man from Alabama. So they did have to work outside the home. But yeah, they weren't, that wasn't the kind of special category that like allowed, or that wasn't the category that allowed their citizenship, right? They were thought to be wives and homemakers, and that was going to be their main role in the U.S. Okay. I think we're good on time. Okay, so I want to go back to this question because we've kind of touched on it already a little bit. This is the front page of that article I just showed you. Do Japanese women make better wives? And this comes from November 12th, 1953. So I don't know if you could read it, it's kind of small. The question is, if the relationships between Black men and Japanese women didn't violate anti-miscegenation laws, why were they policed? So let's back up a little bit. Were these relationships in violation of anti-miscegenation laws? Why? You guys both went like...
Well, because it's two non-white people in a relationship with each other, so it doesn't break any of the miscegenation laws as they're laid out, is what I can remember.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so these relationships don't include a white person, right? Kenneth, did you want to add to that, or were you going to say the same thing? Yeah, so most of the anti-miscegenation laws we've talked about in this class restricted a white person and a Black person from marrying, right? Those are most of the laws. That's the kind of foundation, right? And we talked about ideas about white racial purity, right? In the West, we talked about specifically California, where those laws were amended to include East Asian men and later Filipino men, right? So those laws, but again, didn't restrict the marriage between a Black man and an Asian woman, right? Now, depending on, the situation and depending on the clerk who was overseeing the marriage, because as we've seen, so many of these laws were policed by kind of ordinary kind of civil servants, right, who had to decide whether this person was white or black or Mexican and white and all of that. So depending on the situation, one could categorize a Japanese woman as white, right? Although on the West Coast in California that had a larger Asian population, that likelihood was smaller, right? So for the most part, these relationships don't violate anti-miscegenation laws, but yet they're still policed in many ways. Why is that? Sophie?
It reminds me about the primary source you gave to us on the test about how like children of like white women and Asian men, like they didn't know what they were going to be, what they were going to grow up as. So it reminds me of that, like maybe there's a fear of what these mixed children will grow up to be because they don't know what they're going to be.
Okay, yeah, good point. Okay, so there could be, uncertainty about like how these children are going to be racially categorized in a very like black and white world. Alex?
I kind of thought it was more in the sense that it was like you have two different ethnic groups, and if they actually team up together, that it's like even more people that are supporting each other and saying, hey, it's wrong for white people to, discriminate against all of us. And so if you actually have like a two mixing of diverse ethnic groups, they would actually band together versus keeping them separate, saying like, oh, you can't trust the Asians. They look down on black people. Same thing with black people. If you divide them up, then white people stay on top. But if you get them together.
I see. So it's a fear of Afro-Asian solidarity. Okay. Oscar?
Yeah, I'm basically going to say the same thing, but it's like challenging like the racial caste system that was existing, which is why like people like Fred Hampton were like seen as so like dangerous to American society for like bringing different people of different racial identities together.
Yeah, okay. So you brought up Fred Hampton. Who was Fred Hampton, for those who don't know?
The leader of the Black Panther Party?
Yeah, the Chicago chapter or the Illinois chapter, right?
The Chicago.
And why was he, can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, so he started the Rainbow Coalition, which is like bringing like poor white people, Asian people, black people, like all races together and uniting them against like white supremacy.
And capitalism?
Yeah, capitalism specifically, but it was like, then he was labeled as a communist and was targeted by the CIA and murdered by the CIA.
Yeah.
He was like 21 or 20.
Yeah, a very charismatic leader of the Black Panther Party, and he was successfully organizing in Appalachia, organizing poor white people and building these multiracial coalitions, and then he was murdered by the Chicago PD. So absolutely, right? There is, and these relationships challenge the American racial hierarchy in a lot of ways, right? But going back to Sophie's comment earlier, but also reinforced kind of gender hierarchies, right? Because even if you think back to Jim Crow Tokyo, black men, were black men and women, right, who were in the armed forces, were subjected to racial discrimination. If you can remember the Meiji Pool incident, right? There were these kind of de facto Jim Crow laws. They were often assigned the, least paid kind of menial jobs in the military. There was kind of outright racial violence against American military by their white compatriots. But despite all that, they are still have, in some ways, you can think about it as having access or able to enjoy the privileges of being part of the American military, right? In which they are still the conquerors, right? They are the winners of the war. The U.S. is in power, right? So they're still men in uniform. So it's a very kind of contentious space in which they occupy, right? And especially these relationships that are pushing against the racial hierarchy in the U.S., but at the same time kind of reinforcing the gender hierarchy in some ways. And then last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about the NAACP. So I want to show you this. This is a letter from an Italian woman. So I didn't expect you to read this, but so many of you are reading. You have really great vision. I'm not going to read it, or I'll read a small snippet. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But this is, I think this is dated 1946, February, and it comes from Napoli, Italy. And it's an Italian woman who is writing the NAACP, and she's saying that Aaron Amos, the son of Samuel and Elizabeth from Bridgeport, Connecticut, that she became engaged to him. And that during the engagement, he came to her house frequently. He promised that he was going to marry her. But then he left and has not returned. And she lost her honor to this man and is now the kind of talk of the town. And so she writes the NAACP, and she's like, therefore I come to you, having lost my honor and being the talk of the town without even the chance to defend myself. I pray earnestly in the confessional that Providence will in some way come to my rescue. I anxiously await the success of this matter. So she's writing the NAACP. It's like, can you help me find him? Right? Interesting. And then this is just a copy of, this is the copy of the letter that is cited in the article, Corporal Brown, where he's writing the NAACP, specifically the legal committee, and saying that the military is not allowing black men to marry Japanese women. And interestingly, he doesn't position it as an affront to kind of black autonomy, like an affront to his own autonomy, but he sees it as part of anti-Asian racism, right, in immigration law. So he writes this letter to the NAACP asking the NAACP to act on his behalf. And as we know from the article, they do try to reconcile, but they're limited, right? They don't have the legal capacity to challenge immigration law, right? And so we see this as quite different from the kind of pre-war period, right? As we saw when we read the piece on Jack Johnson, the NAACP before the war supported or didn't support, or excuse me, challenged anti-miscegenation laws, right? But that was kind of a low priority on their agenda, right? In the post-World War II period, after there's like an influx of letters from women in Europe, mostly in Europe, at least that's what's saved in the archives, but also servicemen who are stationed in Europe and in Japan. There's an influx of servicemen and their girlfriends, their ex-girlfriends, their wives who are writing, right, and making this a civil rights issue, right? They're writing the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, asking for help in kind of reconciling some of their kind of, romantic legal woes. And so this demonstrates a shift in kind of the NAACP stance from the pre-war period to the post-war period. So as we saw in the article, the NAACP supports interracial intimacy, right? As an extension of servicemen's rights. So when they are writing to the military, when they are writing to politicians in the US, they're saying that these men served the military, right? They did their duty like their white compatriots. They should be allowed to marry and immigrate with whomever they choose. They highlighted the kind of American hypocrisy, both within the military, but also immigration law. So here, the NAACP is kind of getting entangled in immigration law. But of course, they have limited legal power, right? And so this kind of parallels a shift in the NAACP's critique of U.S. racial politics. Because no longer, after World War II, are they so concerned with kind of domestic issues, but they start to think of kind of broader issues, right? Particularly when it comes to servicemen and women who are abroad in larger numbers. and eventually leads to an expansion of their scope beyond just racial violence, segregation, and disenfranchisement. These were the kind of key issues in the pre-war period and remain key issues as well in the post-war period. But there is a kind of new way of thinking about civil rights, a more expansive way, that it is about voting rights, that it is about housing and school segregation and the end of racial violence, but it's also about thinking about how the right to marry and live with in peace whoever you choose is also part of this discourse, right? It's part of this thinking about what civil rights entails. Any questions? Okay. All right, well, I think that is it for today.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Book Notes Plus podcast, you can find all the episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Lectures in History will be back next week.